If you're like me, you basically have Elden Ring tunnel vision at this point and are just counting down the days until January 22nd, 2022, when From Software's forthcoming game is slated to release. Now, I've talked about this on my channel before, but I admittedly struggle at times to pry myself away from Soulsborne games. It's like, well, I could play any number of other games in my ever-growing backlog, and a lot of great games have come out in the last year or two. Or I could just run Demon's Souls or Dark Souls 3 again. From Software has spoiled me with some of the greatest video games ever made, and while this can sound a bit hyperbolic, fellow fans know what I'm talking about. It sometimes feels like Soulsborne has somewhat ruined other games for me. FromSoft has done so much to elevate the medium, to raise the bar when it comes to lore, art direction, minute-to-minute gameplay. Sometimes it can feel like everything else just pales by comparison. Over the last decade, my love of Soulsborne has turned me into a somewhat jaded, curmudgeonly, hard-to-please gamer. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It just means, yeah, I don't enjoy a lot of the mainstream games that other people do. And that pool of non-Soulsborne games that can scratch that itch for me, certain platformers, racing simulators, etc., doesn't run very deep these days. Well, you might ask, what about Soulslikes? Well, hypothetical question poser, let's talk about this relatively new subgenre of games that, plainly stated, are inspired by the mechanics of Demon's Souls or Dark Souls. But what does that mean? Well, it means the inclusion of certain roguelike elements, such as dungeon crawling, combat-based gameplay, and the presence of some level of permadeath or loss of progress. These are the basic ingredients. But more specifically, in a true Souls-like, I'm expecting high difficulty, dramatic boss encounters, a skill-based learning curve, dark, gritty aesthetics, and a sense of isolationism or solipsism. On one hand, the Souls-like label and its misuse at times by gaming journalists can make me cringe pretty hard, as can this idea that certain developers may be attempting to inauthentically replicate what From Software has done. But on the other hand, next to the Soulsborne games, one of my favorite other franchises is Doom. And the original Doom, along with Wolfenstein and a few other titles, basically invented the modern-day first-person shooter genre. But does that mean you're misguided if you like other FPS games that followed Doom, like Quake or Perfect Dark or Halo Combat Evolved? Or that you're misguided if you develop those kinds of games? This is where that kind of elitist, close-minded thinking is exposed for exactly what it is: silly and a waste of time. Because I appreciate Doom for what it is and what it did, while simultaneously appreciating a lot of other FPS games that followed. So with all that being said, I'm actively trying to turn a corner in this department. And don't get me wrong, I'm gonna keep my curmudgeon hat nearby at all times. But I do want to cut through that fog to some degree and make sure I'm not willfully missing out on awesome experiences I would otherwise enjoy. That brings me to Mortal Shell. Now, a quick road sign. I am going to be showing off Mortal Shell gameplay footage throughout the rest of this video, which could be considered slightly spoilery depending on your sensitivity to that kind of thing. But I won't be showing anything that wasn't already shown in the game's official trailers, and I won't be giving away anything about lore, the final boss, or the game's ending. No major spoilers. This Souls-like, created by developer Cold Symmetry and published by PlayStack, released 1 year ago to a decent amount of interest and fanfare, given the fact that it's a new niche IP by an indie developer whose core team during development only consisted of 15 people. How about that? And over the last year, as I saw the game's marketing campaigns, I couldn't deny that it looked pretty sick. The game's color palette, the armor and weapon designs, etc. But that curmudgeonly side of me always wrote the game off. Nah, I probably wouldn't like it, it's probably not that good, just a cheap Dark Souls imitation. Well, the game just got new DLC in the last week. It's called the Virtuous Cycle, and Cold Symmetry, in an amazing display of pro-consumerism, actually made the DLC free to keep for all players for the first 5 days following its release. And that's what pushed me over the edge. Okay, I thought, what's the harm in giving this game a shot? Nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? But still, I popped that disc into my PlayStation 5 console fully expecting to be disappointed, fully expecting that the game would fail to meet my high expectations. And within the first hour of my initial playthrough, I was proven completely wrong. Mortal Shell goes right up there alongside Returnal as one of the biggest gaming surprises I've had in recent memory. It hooked me almost instantly with its combat loop and beautiful art direction. Part of my arrogance was that I came in expecting to walk all over this game. I thought to myself, come on, I've speedrun Soulsborne games. What could Mortal Shell possibly do to me? Well, it killed me. Many times, especially early in my first playthrough. This game absolutely has a unique skill-based learning curve. Stamina or posture management is a pillar of combat gameplay in Soulsborne. I've talked about this topic in other videos, but it might be even more critical to the gameplay of Mortal Shell. A lean, shieldless dexterity build is my go-to in Souls games, and that ability to buff my endurance and dexterity stats allows me to attack and dodge pretty freely, pretty confidently, at all times. When I'm at my best in a game like Dark Souls 3, I'm basically untouchable. I'm worry-free. But in Mortal Shell, I have one eye trained on my stamina meter at all times. I'm always wondering, how much do I have left? What do I do defensively if it runs out? If I have to make a move before it can replenish? But this is all by design. It's a pillar of Mortal Shell's combat loop. Because there's a tighter leash on stamina use, it actually increases my engagement in combat. I mean, imagine for a moment if Sekiro didn't have a posture system. How much fun would combat, especially boss battles, be? How engaged would you feel after an hour with the game? I think the entire experience would fall apart. You could say the same about any Soulsborne game, really. What if there were no limits on magic use, etc.? And for Mortal Shell, this limitation, so to speak, is what keeps me on my toes, why I have to be strategic and hyper-vigilant in combat about every single move I make. Now, as I understand it, given the scale of this project in terms of resources and team size, Cold Symmetry didn't have the bandwidth to offer fully customizable characters with seemingly infinite armor and weapon combinations, like we've become so used to in Soulsborne games. Instead, they cleverly based the game around its namesake shells. So your player character is simply this alien-looking musculoskeletal orphan of Soulslike thing called a foundling. And you essentially inhabit dead bodies or shells. You occupy these lifeless suits of armor that once belonged to real people in this world. And as you inhabit these shells and develop their skill trees, you actually learn about the people behind the shells, who they were and what motivated them in life. And naturally, each shell looks and feels and plays differently. There's a fast, lean dexterity type. There's a slower but big tanky strength type. There's a more balanced and middle-of-the-road type. Some shells have less stamina but more health, and then vice versa. And as I said, the same goes for weapons. There's a handful of unique weapons in the world that you can acquire, and you can also find and use special materials to upgrade and alter those weapons. So a big part of the game is this fun discovery process in which you figure out which shell and weapon combination best suits your taste. During my playthrough, I switched back and forth between Teal the Acolyte and Solomon the Scholar. Those are my two favorites, but all 5 available shells are really cool. The shells have different colorways too, called shades, which you can swap between, and some of those are exceptional. Now, of course, I can't wait to create my custom speedy, shieldless, tarnished swordsman in Elden Ring. That will rule. But I don't see Mortal Shell's comparatively limited options as a downside or weak point. Creatively speaking, limitations aren't always a bad thing. Sometimes if you can do absolutely anything with no structure or limits, that can lead to boring aimlessness, a product that lacks a strong identity. And I love Mortal Shell's straightforward simplicity. What shell do I want? What shade do I want? What weapon do I want? Go. Mortal Shell's combat gameplay largely revolves around this hardening mechanic, which makes your player character impervious to damage by hardening into stone for as long as you want, or until the hardening is broken via an enemy attack. You can harden at any given time with a few second cooldown afterward. In a way, hardening kind of functions like a parry. Now, there is straightforward timing-based parries in the game. There's an item you can acquire early on that allows your player character to parry. So defensively, you have dodging, parrying, and hardening, and then offensively you have light attacks, heavy attacks, and weapon abilities that are almost like weapon arts from Dark Souls 3 or Sekiro. My favorite weapon in the game, the Smoldering Mace, its abilities include a fiery ground-striking AoE attack, and an option to buff or imbue the mace with flames, causing extra fire damage to any enemy it touches. And how do you activate these weapon abilities? Well, you have a resolve system. And how do you primarily fill those resolve bars? You deal damage to enemies. This is Mortal Shell's addictive combat loop. Your resolve bars and weapon abilities encourage you to be offensive, while parrying and hardening encourage you to be defensive. And every action requires stamina, as I mentioned earlier, except hardening. While hardening, you can actually replenish your stamina, but in order to harden, you have to be free of the cooldown. So for example, if you're right in front of an enemy, if you harden in a panic because you have no stamina, but then that enemy immediately breaks your harden, you're now exposed to that enemy at point blank range with no way to attack or defend yourself, meaning that enemy will probably kill you. Conversely, you could smartly harden with plenty of stamina while entering your attack animation, allowing the enemy to break and bounce off your hardened shell, leaving them open to your oncoming attack, and then you still have enough stamina in the bank to roll away, establish distance with your enemy, and reset for the next sequence. And because of the damage you successfully dealt, you now have enough resolve to activate one of your weapon abilities and finish the enemy off entirely. This is the beauty of Mortal Shell's combat loop. Oh, and if you do die, you get knocked out of your shell and with only 1 HP, have one opportunity to reclaim your shell before you die for good, a system that feels influenced by Sekiro's Shadows Die Twice system. And everything I'm talking about here should sound familiar to any Soulsborne fan. Stamina, parries, weapon arts, etc. But the application in Mortal Shell feels different. Certain elements of level design and enemy placement definitely remind me of Soulsborne, and they're clearly supposed to. But the minute-to-minute combat loop is where Mortal Shell stands, in my opinion, as a unique and very worthwhile experience. Plus, in Mortal Shell, there's unique nuances. Your player character has more weight to them, feels more grounded. The timing of attack and parry animations is different, and so on. In the summer of 2020, the executive team at Symmetry told IGN that due to project limitations, there's no motion capture in Mortal Shell, and all the animations rely on keyframes, which I think is pretty impressive. There are some sick animations in this game. One enemy comes to mind. He actually rips off his own head and throws it at you, killing himself but poisoning you in the process. How heavy metal is that? Or one boss in particular has this attack in which he throws his sword into the ground before gracefully lunging, yanking the sword up and into the air and then toward you, all in one fluid sweeping sequence. The fact that Symmetry made everything look so good, given the lack of motion capture, is commendable. And I can't emphasize enough just how many cool enemy designs are in this game. After playing the Soulsborne games, you assume you've seen it all, but there's some uniquely inspired stuff in Mortal Shell. The sturdy men, unburning fleshes, slaves of scorn, enslaved disciples, and faceless clerics are some of my personal favorites. I think the bosses are great too. Are they as advanced and best in class as some Soulsborne bosses? No, I don't think so. But are they cooler and more interesting than most boss battles in most other third-person action games out there? Yeah, in my opinion, they are. Imrod is probably my personal favorite. The enslaved Grisha is sick too. The Cold Symmetry co-founders like Dimitri Parkin and Anton Gonzalez have posted a bunch of these designs to their Instagram pages, and they're so cool to admire in a vacuum like that. And on the topic of those limitations, yes, Mortal Shell does not feature as many locations and bosses as Dark Souls 3, let's say. That's true. But it's a new IP by a small developer and is only being sold for $30, so I don't have a problem with the game's length. The length feels appropriate given the circumstances. Honestly, I've had so much fun with Mortal Shell that I probably would have paid $60 for it. That voting with your money idea. Would it be awesome if the game was 2 or 3 times as long? Absolutely, because it's a good game. I've said this kind of thing before, and I'll repeat myself here. I'd much rather have fun and be totally engaged with a 10 to 20 hour game that I'm motivated to replay and revisit again and again for years to come, versus being bored and slogging through a 100-hour fetch quest fest that I never touch again. Mortal Shell's DLC also adds a new roguelike cycle/mode into the game, and there's a lot of potential for shell-less speedruns and stuff, and anyone who's attempting to get all of the game's trophies or achievements will have plenty to do as well. The game has some wonderfully charming and comedic touches too. You can pet a cat, there's hidden merchants, and what felt like a bit of an Ocarina of Time homage, you can feed and play one of your loots to this giant toad named Gorf, who will then vomit on you, which changes your shell shade. Oh yeah, and the loots themselves, they're incredible. You can find different loots around the world and learn to play different songs on them, and the music is beautifully and authentically recorded. You can just tell. You can plop down anytime, anywhere, and jam some tunes. In a way, that made me think of my experience with Ghost of Tsushima. For me, that game was less about plot and characters, and it was much more about all of those wonderful little touches. Petting animals, writing haikus, playing the flute. In short, the in-game atmosphere that the team at Cold Symmetry created is stunning. There's an ambient soundscape that's seemingly playing at all times. This soundscape, created by Atrium Carcery, is dark, guttural, industrial, and does a lot to immerse you in this world and its dungeons. And that world's color palette is gorgeous. Shades of grays, pale greens, and slaty blacks. This all plays into the game's prominent black metal aesthetics. I've been a musician my whole life, and I always appreciate genuine musical touches in video games. And Mortal Shell is clearly inspired by black metal aesthetics, and many of the armor and weapon designs, plus in-game locations like Fallgrim, Dim Gate, Martyr's Altar, every inch of the Shrine of Ash, make me feel like I've been transported to the set of a black metal music video. Now, if metal is not your cup of tea, that's fine, but if you know anything about metal, what do you picture when you think of the subgenre of black metal? Maybe rolling Scandinavian hillsides, fog and rain, black and white corpse paint, iron and steel, satanic imagery, the list goes on. Cold Symmetry added an optional music pack to the game that adds music by black metal band Rotting Christ to every boss battle. For my first playthrough, I had this pack downloaded but didn't even realize it was turned on, and when I got to the first tutorial boss and the music kicked in, I got goosebumps. These tracks are so good, and in my opinion, perfectly match the gameplay and boss arenas. The chugging guitars, the pounding double bass drums. I give Cold Symmetry credit here too. Black metal remains a controversial genre, and rotting Christ's name alone could offend some people. But this was clearly part of their artistic vision for their game, and they stuck to it, and I respect that. As a huge Doom and Quake fan and a huge Soulsborne fan, playing Mortal Shell, a Souls-like, with this kind of heavy metal music in the background is basically my perfect marriage of both worlds. I love it. It really speaks to me and my sensibilities, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Look, not everyone is going to love Mortal Shell, even some longtime Soulsborne fans. And that's fine. We don't all have to agree on everything. I don't tell people what they should and shouldn't play on my channel. That's not my style. All I can say is I love this game, and I know I'll be enjoying it for a long time to come. I can only hope for more DLC, or gosh, a full-fledged sequel with more shells and weapons and bosses. What's already on offer is so good, all we need is more of it. And it'd be so interesting to see how the team could iterate on what's already in place, specifically the combat mechanics. There's a relatively small but super passionate community surrounding this game too. It's not hard to find fans on Twitter, Instagram, Discord, and elsewhere. I also read that earlier this year, Mortal Shell surpassed 500,000 sales, which seems like a great milestone for this game. Do I have any gripes about the game? Sure, no game's perfect, and I don't expect any game to be perfect. There's some wonky hitboxes, some mandatory cutscenes that freeze the player in place and allow nearby enemies to get in a free hit, some enemy pop-in issues that can affect your immersion. Transporting glands back to Fulgrim Tower is a cool idea, but in practice over time is a process I found to be a little annoying, especially as ganked squads of enemies teleport in from the sky and chase after you. And admittedly, I feel that as you learn this game's systems, it can become a little too easy, easier than From Software's games, that's for sure. The dodging, the attacking, the ability to exploit certain enemies and bosses, and hey, maybe that's my reward for being patient and bothering to learn the game's mechanics. Or maybe I simply want a greater challenge, and honestly, I need to dig deeper into the new DLC to see if I can find that greater challenge there. But these notes pale in comparison to everything I enjoy about this game. A game I thought was going to be a mere appetizer, if that, to Elden Ring. But that kind of language feels disrespectful given the great work that Cold Symmetry did. You can feel the TLC in this game. As I said before, it's an experience that stands on its own. My initial playthrough of Mortal Shell was just under 20 hours, and I did a fair bit of messing around too. I spent a lot of time fighting enemies for fun and doing some completionist activities. How Souls-like does this sound? I actually beat half the game without realizing I could level up my weapon. It'd be like the equivalent of playing through Dark Souls for the first time and never talking to Blacksmith Andre, or realizing that you could give him Titanite to improve the damage output of your primary weapon. I couldn't help but laugh when I realized this, and in hindsight, playing through half the game with a base level weapon actually made me much more proficient in the long run. I don't regret it at all. So let me know in the comments, have you played Mortal Shell? And if so, what did you think? Do you share my feelings about the game? Or what about Souls-likes in general? Do you tend to like them, dislike them? Are there other Souls-likes that you've enjoyed? And remember, as always, you can find me on Twitter at TerrapopTweets, on Instagram at TerrapopGram, on Discord at Terrapop's Treehouse, and on Patreon at patreon.com/Terrapop, where I offer all kinds of cool tiers and perks for my patrons. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll catch you next time.